90-day stroke recovery process and trajectory, using viscoplastic energy analysis, number 1360, VMT Sharp 702, September 19, 2025. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Stroke. Preface: Stroke remains one of the leading causes of mortality and long-term disability worldwide. Globally, it accounts for about 10.7% of all deaths, making it the third leading cause of death overall, after ischemic heart disease and COVID-19. The burden is especially severe in low and middle-income countries, where stroke mortality rates remain higher than in wealthier nations. Regionally, stroke is the third leading cause of death in both Japan and Taiwan, ranking just behind cancer and heart disease, while in the United Kingdom, it is typically the fourth leading cause, responsible for about 5.1% of all deaths in UK in 2022. In the United States, stroke has also shifted to the fourth leading cause of death in recent years, though it continues to be a major contributor to national mortality. The period immediately following a stroke, often termed the golden 90 days, is critical, because the brain retains heightened neuroplastic repairing potential. During this time, patients may regain a significant portion of lost function, provided that recovery efforts are systematic, sustained, and guided by both clinical knowledge and patient self-management. Traditional stroke recovery studies focus on clinical endpoints such as motor improvement, functional scales, or survival rates. However, few studies attempt to capture the dynamic systems process of recovery, using quantitative frameworks that integrate vascular, metabolic, behavioral, and cognitive dimensions. In my case, my mobility, including hands, arms, and legs, as well as my speech, have not been affected at all. In fact, my cognitive ability appears to have improved after the stroke. This is reflected in my medical research work, where not only has my paper productivity increased by about 25% compared with the pre-stroke period, but I also approach research problems with broader perspectives and deeper interpretative insights. The only significant issue I face is memory loss, which affects both short-term and long-term recall. I remain uncertain, however, whether some of these memory deficits are attributable to the stroke itself, or simply to the natural process of aging. In this article, I apply the Viscoplastic Energy Model, VMT, originally adapted from nonlinear engineering, mechanics and materials science, to analyze my own stroke recovery trajectory. By selecting 4 key stressors and 1 strain outcome, and by calculating energy contribution ratios over a 13-week, 91-day period, I was able to measure not only how much recovery occurred, but also which factors drove recovery. This quantitative systems approach bridges the gap between descriptive clinical reports and the mechanistic processes underlying brain repair, in contrast to traditional medical research papers that rely primarily on simple statistical methods. VMT research method: strain selection of memory test design. Memory recovery scores were selected as the primary strain variable. A score of 1.0 represents perfect recovery, while higher scores indicate greater cognitive impairment. To generate these values, I performed daily self-administered therapy and memory tests, each containing 20 or more items. These tasks targeted multiple cognitive domains: verbal recall, remembering a list of 10 food items after a single glance at my own refrigerator; visual recall, watching a political debate or news program on YouTube, and then writing down either the contents or the names of all candidates and commentators; auditory recall, listening to different music pieces, distinguishing subtle differences in melody, and identifying the performers, instruments, or singers; working memory, using puzzle books, designed for senior citizens and dementia patients, which required memorizing sequences of numbers, words, or shapes before solving. By the way, there is very little information available on cognitive and memory recovery therapy. In addition, stroke doctors have never offered me any practical suggestions on how to carry it out. Scoring and averaging method. Each test produced a numerical score, reflecting the percentage of correctly recalled or identified items. These daily results were averaged weekly to reduce variability, and to establish consistent measures over time. Together, this structured approach allowed me to quantify memory performance across verbal, visual, auditory, and working memory domains, making the score a practical and repeatable measure of recovery. These self-tests serve as routine training and assessment of my memory capacity, but the ultimate problem-solving test comes from my ongoing, uninterrupted medical research work. This daily activity requires deep thinking, analysis, synthesis, and higher-level cognitive function, providing a continuous benchmark of my ability to process and integrate complex information. My decision to use memory recovery as the strain variable reflects the fact that it is the only symptom I have observed thus far. My stroke was associated with a cerebral small vessel rupture in the pons area near the brain stem. However, my stroke doctor remains uncertain about how this location could be directly connected to my memory loss symptoms. They are still investigating whether the 2 seizures I experienced after the stroke on June 21, 2025 may have contributed to my memory deficits. Memory difficulties following a stroke are often driven more by seizures and their aftereffects than by the pontine hemorrhage itself. Recovery remains possible through neuroplasticity, supported by consistent memory exercises, careful seizure management, and adequate rest. In short, my doctors are correct. My memory loss is more likely the result of the 2 post-stroke seizures rather than the bleed in the pons. For stressor selection, the BP index is calculated as 0.5 times the sum of the highest systolic blood pressure, divided by 140, and the pulse pressure divided by 45. Blood pressure, especially highest SBP and pulse pressure, PP, reflects vascular stiffness and the acute risk of surges. The T2D index is calculated as 0.5 times the sum of the fasting plasma glucose, divided by 90, and the estimated average glucose divided by 120. Glucose metabolism is a slower wave signal, capturing chronic metabolic burden. The STEPS index is calculated as 4,000, divided by the total number of daily steps. Walking activity is both a recovery tool and a stressor, highlighting the balance between effort and fatigue. My pre-stroke normalization was 10,000 steps per day, but recovery phase normalization was adjusted to 4,000 steps per day to reflect physiological limits. The sleep index is calculated as 8 hours, divided by the total number of daily sleep hours. Sleep is essential for neuroplasticity and energy replenishment. Pre-stroke, I averaged 6 to 7 hours per night with no naps. Post-stroke, I required extended rest, averaging 8.5 hours per day with at least 1 nap. Why this framework works. The design of this framework rests on the fundamental principle of viscoplastic modeling. Strain reflects accumulated system damage, while stressors represent the external and internal forces applied over time. The memory score acts as a direct measure of my memory recovery trajectory, linking cognitive performance to physiological repair. Blood pressure, as a high-frequency wave, highlights rapid oscillations and acute surges, but its steady decline during recovery period. 1.07, 0.97, indicates my effective stabilization of hypertension. Glucose, as a low-frequency wave, reflects chronic metabolic load. Maintaining the T2D index below 1.0 minimized my background metabolic stress. Walking steps provided functional engagement, representing nearly half of the recovery energy and serving as the largest recovery energy contributor. However, they also revealed periodic dips due to fatigue. If I were able to walk more steps each day, the VMT energy contribution percentage would be lower. Unfortunately, since the stroke, I have often felt more easily fatigued, which limits my walking capacity. Sleep, a critical restorative factor, increased significantly after my stroke, and played an important role in supporting neuronal recovery and consolidation. I have been able to obtain sufficient sleep and rest throughout my 90 days of stroke recovery period. Data observations. Cognitive recovery. Memory recovery improved from 62% in week 1 through 99% in week 7 to 100% in week 13. This sharp improving trajectory suggests that most recovery occurred within the first half of this golden 90-day window. Vascular and metabolic control, both BP and T2D indices remain stable around 1.0, minimizing stress on cerebral vessels. Physical activity, step count increased slowly, but progressively, though recovery levels remained insufficient compared to my pre-stroke baselines. Sleep, average sleep time rose from 6.5 hours per night, pre-stroke, to 8.5 hours per day, post-stroke, a 30% increase consistent with neuroplastic demands. VMT energy contribution ratios. Steps is 46%, BP is 19%, sleep is 19%, T2D is 16%. Interpretation. The dominant role of walking, 46%, confirms that active physical rehabilitation was the most powerful driver of recovery energy. Blood pressure and sleep, each contributing 19%, emphasize the dual necessity of vascular stability and restorative rest. T2D, the glucose control, while only 16%, remained important as a background factor. Its lower contribution reflects the fact that my glucose was already tightly managed before the stroke, actually since 2014. This VMT energy distribution highlights a practical lesson. Stroke recovery is not evenly distributed across 4 selected stressors. Instead, it is disproportionately driven by physical activity and stabilized by vascular and restorative conditions. Cumulative VMT energy. By week 7, my cumulative recovery energy had already reached 99%. In practical terms, this means that the majority of stroke recovery was completed within the first half of the 90-day golden period. Weeks 8-13 provided consolidation and stabilization, rather than major functional gains. This observation echoes the Front-loaded recovery pattern seen in stroke rehabilitation research, where neuroplastic reorganization occurs most intensively in the early weeks post-event. Discussion. The VMT approach provides 3 novel insights. 1. Quantification of recovery drivers. Traditional studies, such as statistics methods, often describe recovery qualitatively. But VMT quantifies the relative weights of stressors through VMT energies. This is especially useful for patients who want to focus their efforts on high-impact activities. 2. Systems integration, the combination of 4 waves, including high-frequency wave, BP, low-frequency wave, glucose, behavioral wave, steps, and restorative wave, sleep. These 4 input stressors and the strain of memory recovery score creates a more completed holistic picture. Recovery is not the result of one factor but of balanced systemic adaptation. 3. Timing of recovery, the VMT Energy Research Model, confirms the importance of early intervention. Since nearly all recovery energy was expended by week 7, delays in initiating rehabilitation may result in missed opportunities. From a pathophysiological perspective, this makes sense. Early recovery leverages neuroplasticity, angiogenesis, and synaptic remodeling, all of which are time-sensitive processes. Once vessel stability and neural rewiring plateau, the rate of improvement slows, explaining why gains after the first 7 weeks were minimal. Conclusion. This 90-day strike recovery analysis, especially for memory recovery, has demonstrated that stroke recovery is a nonlinear, energy-dependent process. By applying VMT modeling, I quantified how 4 stressors influenced one strain outcome, revealing that 1. The first 7 weeks are decisive, with nearly complete recovery achieved by midpoint. 2. Walking steps dominate recovery energy, accounting for nearly half of the total contribution. 3. Stable BP and adequate sleep provide essential support, while T2D plays a smaller but steady background role. This study highlights the value of applying math, physics, and engineering-based models to medical recovery. VMT not only captures the dynamic interactions of stressors and strain, but also provides a quantitative roadmap for patients and clinicians during the critical golden period of stroke rehabilitation. Appendix, VMT Framework. For details, please search Health Talk with EclaireMD on YouTube. Disclaimer. This content is for educational reference only and not medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this study freely, but it must not be edited or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.